Welcome to today's Ravenna webinar, SMPTE ST 2110-31 applications. The webinar will be recorded live, so you may have the chance to download the recording and the slide deck after the webinar, but please allow us 1 or 2 days to process the recording, and then you can find that one on the Ravenna website. So today we are diving into an interesting topic, and that's about audio metadata, actually. So let me introduce myself first. My name is Andreas Hildebrand. I'm working as a Ravenna technology evangelist at ALC Networks out of Munich in Germany, and ALC Networks, the company who has defined the Ravenna IP media networking technology, and we are also participating very actively in various standardization organizations, namely AS and SMPTE, to help defining the media over IP standards. So we have a guest, of course, today. I'm very happy to have James Cowdery with me. James Cowdery is working for Dolby out of San Francisco. So it's morning time there. So good morning, James. Hope you are well and out of bed and had a strong coffee. And James is with Dolby since 2004. He has a strong background on digital signal processing. He initiated and managed the professional licensing engineering at Dolby and is currently focused on working as an audio and metadata carriage over IP architect. So, and I don't have to introduce Ravenna partner Dolby any further. I guess that is a name which stands on its own. So before I call James on going into the details of the topic, I'll provide a quick introduction. So I will quickly dive on the data formats of AS67 Ravenna SMPTE 2110 to set the scene, and then James will take it from there, review SMPTE ST 337 and its use cases. He will quickly introduce how Dolby E is being transported within SMPTE 337 and how this is achieved with Ravenna's AM824 or SMPTE ST 2110-31. And he will also give us an introduction into metadata applications and usage for next generation audio production. So that's what we're trying to cover today. So let's jump right into the topic. First thing, quick introduction again on AS67. The latest revision of this standard has been published 2018. The standards group is working on updates of the standard, but whatever happens, we are of course trying to preserve full backward compatibility so that we don't break the standard as it stands, because it's a very, very successful standard related to streaming audio over IP interoperability. So what does that mean? Actually, we had a number of solutions which were based on IP, but they weren't able to talk directly to each other, although they were based on the same principles of IP transport, except for LiveWire and Ravenna, where we managed to have an IP-based interchange dating back before the publication of AS67 back in 2012. But AS67 set the scene for interoperability. And so they defined a number of functional blocks and particular specifications, which, if they are supported or implemented by these different solutions, would allow a direct interchange between them without having to leave the IP layer. So for that purpose, the technology or the standardization group defined technology components, as you can see here. From synchronization, transport, encoding, all the way up to connection management, and they defined mandatory parameters or protocol requirements which would have to be met in order to be AS67 compliant. Just for the sake of having everything lined up, discovery is also quite often part of audio over IP solutions, but it's not required actually to have technical interoperability. So AS67 is silent on discovery, but as of now, we know that many different and various technologies are out there, namely those specified by AMBA, NMOS, ISO4, ISO5, which are a perfect enhancement to AS67 to cover discovery and parts of connection management. Today, we are going to focus on the encoding part of AS67. That is where specified what payload formats are supported by the transport standard. And as we all know, AS67 requires that solutions support L16 and L24, that's linear PCM audio with up to 8 channels per stream with a mandatory packet time of 1 millisecond, which at 48 kilohertz is 48 samples per frame. So that's the scene AS67 has set forth. The question, of course, is, since this is a Ravenna webinar, how differ AS67 and Ravenna from each other? Basically, there is not much difference. AS67 is setting forth some functional blocks and some requirements for those, like, the encoding, the audio channel separate, and so on. And Ravenna basically has all of this, but adds further options and variations to any of these requirements. And for today, it's important to have a look at the media format. As you can see, Ravenna had AS-EBU or AS3 transport right from the very beginning as an optional media format. Ravenna also adds redundancy and discovery as a solution, which is not part of AS67. So in other words, Ravenna is covering every requirement AS67 is setting forth. So Ravenna has AS67 built in with more options and more features. How do we manage this within Ravenna and keep interoperability among Ravenna implementations who support this huge variety of different options? Well, here's another look at the very same picture. We have a number of functional blocks and requirements for AS67. Ravenna has all of them as well, with more options and more functionality. And Ravenna defines these variations by introducing profiles. So there's the generic profile, high performance profile, live legacy profile, there's a MADI over IP profile. And from the perspective of Ravenna, AS67 is nothing than a particular profile specification, which, by the way, is very, very similar to the generic profile Ravenna had in place at first hand anyway. So that's how Ravenna and AS67 go hand in hand. And now a quick look into SMPTE ST 2110, the professional media over management, over managed IP network transport standard. The SMPTE 2110 specifies transport synchronization and description of separate elementary essence streams, so video, audio, and serial data being transported on separate streams over managed IP networks, of course, not the internet, for real-time production, playout, and other professional media applications. So from that perspective, it's not much different than Ravenna or AS67, except that it also covers, of course, video and serial data. And it does this by unpacking the active video content from a typical SDI signal, transporting that as an individual essence streams. It's then taking the audio part of the SDI signal, transporting that as another independent IP stream, and the SDI metadata is also taken out of the SDI signal and transported as yet another independent essence data stream. The synchronization, needless to say, is maintained through PTP, just like within Ravenna and AS67. And for today, we don't want to dive any further into a SMPTE 2110, except for having a quick look at the audio parts. So the 2110 standard is a suite of documents, which describe different parts of the standard. So for audio, the -10 document is relevant because that covers the general overall system timing and definitions, so transport layer, synchronization, and so on. We have the -30 part of the standard, which describes how to transport PCM digital audio, which is basically the same as AS67. And we have the -31 document, which describes how to transport AS3 in a bit transparent manner. Now let's have a quick look at the PCM, linear PCM audio transport. That's the 10 and 30 document, -10-30 document. And without any further details, you can actually say whatever is specified in these two documents is matched by the existing AS67 standard. Well, quite close. SMPTE has added some constraints, actually, which are further detailed in a separate white paper, which is available either on the RAVENNA website or on the AIMS website. It's called AS67 2110 Commonalities and Constraints, where these particular constraints are described a bit further. In general, you can say the SMPTE 2110 standard is covered by the mandatory requirements of AS67. Even the extended level B and also level C options in 2110-30 are already covered with the optional definitions of the AS67 standard, as I said, except for some constraints which need to be matched by AS67 devices. So if we ask about the compatibility between AS67 and -30, we can state that -30 is partly contained within, or for the most parts, contained in the AS67 specification, except again for those constraints. And for the stream interoperability, which is even more important than the standards compatibility, it is the case that any -30 stream is immediately be compatible with an AS67 receiver. So any AS67 device can receive a -30 stream. However, if an AS67 transmitter wants to transmit to a -30 receiver, these constraints need to be regarded by the AS67 transmitter. But I can tell you from the practical point of view that basically every device, every AS67 device out there is now actually matching those particular constraints. So there should not be any issue with interoperability between AS67 and -30, the linear PCM audio transport. So how does that look for -31, the transparent transport of AS3 audio data? So what is AS3 audio data in contrast to linear 24 PCM? Well, basically, from the audio perspective, from the linear audio perspective, it is 24-bit PCM, but with additional subframe metadata bits, namely the PCUV bits. So what is that? If we look at an AS3 data structure, we have a sequence of audio blocks being transmitted across either an AS3 link, a MADI link, a P-link, whatsoever. So one audio block contains of exactly 192 audio frames. And each frame contains, with a stereo signal with the original AS3 definitions, 2 subframes for the left, 1 frame for the left and 1 frame for the right channel. So it's a 2-channel. So if you have a MADI, basically every frame would consist of, up to 64 subframes. So these subframes are basically the left and right channel, and each subframe has 32 bits, which are lined up exactly like this. We have a preamble for those of you who are into AS3. That is the XYZ preamble defining block and subframe starts. We have an 4-bit auxiliary portion and a 20-bit audio data portion. We have validity bit, user data, channel status, and parity bits. And James will definitely explain a bit more on the usage and the importance of those bits. Now, for the transport of linear 24-bit audio, the auxiliary bits and the audio 20-bit portion of that subframe section are used together, so that we have 24-bit PCM audio. And actually, that is how an AS3 signal or a data structure looks like. But the benefit of AS3, of course, is that we also can transport any non-PCM audio, so encoded audio like Dolby E, for example, and also non-audio data formats. And what can be transported is standardized by another SMPTE standard, the SMPTE ST 337 together with 338. And they define how non-PCM or generic data formats are transported within an AS3 data structure. So essentially, basically, it's the 24-bit audio section, which is then replaced by a 24-bit data section as per definition of SMPTE ST 337. So that's how an AS3 data structure looks like. And again, of course, if we want to transport this across IP, we have to extend our existing linear 24-bit payload definitions. And actually, the 2110-30 standard had a closer look at Ravenna's AM824 at the existing Ravenna's AM824 payload definition, and they found that very sound, and they built their standard on Ravenna's existing AM824 payload definition. So basically, the whole AS67 definitions for synchronization and RTP usage are retained or are still in place. We only need to add one additional byte together with the 3 bytes for PCM24 in order to transport the block and frame start structure bits as well as the PCUV bits. So basically that is the payload format, the AM824 payload format, which replaces the 3 bytes of PCM in the AS67 definition. Of course, we need to signal that we have a different payload format in the RTP. That is done through STP by adding AM824 instead of L24 in the RTP map definition line. All the other STP parameters are the same as within Ravenna or AS67, and so we have a high degree of similarity, although we don't have compatibility between AS67 and -31 because AS67 is not aware of the 1 byte of additional payload. So AS67 is out of the game in this case, but Ravenna is fully covering the -31 standard. And thus for stream compatibility, again, AS67 is not part of the game here, but Ravenna is. So every stream which is formatted according to the Ravenna AM824 profile is immediately being receivable by a -31 device and vice versa. Ravenna requires more functionality to be fully Ravenna compliant, but this is not essential to actually interconnect to a -31 sender because everything is in place so that a Ravenna device, even without discovery and further connection management functionality, is capable of receiving a -31 stream. So we have, of course, also example applications, not going to explain this in detail. The essential part is right here in the middle. We are transporting a number of audio objects, including, let's say, audio beds and foreign language tracks through standard AS67 streams. And we are also transporting metadata, and James is going to explain that in much more detail in a minute. And then both are received by a renderer, and according to particular render settings, the renderer is taking the relevant audio data out of the AS67 streams and is rendering whatever needs to be or is desired for the particular output situation. So that concludes the quick introduction, and it's now James' part to take you any further into details, applications, and I hand it over to James.
Okay, can everyone see that? See
Yep.
the agenda? Yep, good.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andreas, for giving me the opportunity to talk about this.
Okay. See you later.
It's great to communicate with everyone just in these difficult times, and I hope everyone's doing well. All those people that I've kind of missed meeting in person. Okay, so we're going to have kind of quick review of 337 for those that are not familiar with it, and then dig into Dolby E. The reason for digging into Dolby E specifically is we had quite a few questions about that format. And that was the real kind of stimulus for doing, or motivation for doing this webinar from my perspective. So that's a kind of legacy use case which is being carried across, and IP is kind of inheriting. We're also going to talk about a new use case for 337 and 2110-31, which is metadata, audio metadata. Okay. So Andreas has mentioned about AS3, professional transport and interconnect for professional audio carrying a stereo pair. SMPTE 337 defines a method for carrying encoded audio or data over that transport. So instead of carrying linear PCM, a certain sample rate, it carries encoded audio or data in bursts, which appear at some kind of period. And if in the case of encoded audio, it's going to be the audio frame period. And there's a header at the beginning, so the burst can be identified, so a bitstream detector can pick it up. And then it gets run through a decoder or some kind of processing device. And all that is carried in the regular audio portion of the AS3 interconnect. The actual data itself, either 16 or 20 or 24 bits. Okay, now it can carry various payloads. I'm just going to kind of run through a few of them here, because some of them are kind of interesting. People may not know the kind of historical context of them. The null data is just a simple kind of maintaining sync with bitstream detector, so it's not very interesting. Dolby Digital is probably one of the most common ones historically that was used. The emission codecs over AS3 are not as common as they once were. The reason for this is because originally the big use case was having a separate audio encoder and then downstream having a video encoder, and you had to get the encoded audio to the video encoder to the muxet. Now audio encoders and video coders are almost always integrated, so there's no need for that interconnect. So that's not as common as it used to be. Timestamps, that as far as I know, the main use case for that was live DVD authoring. In the beginning of DVD authoring days, where you would place a timestamp in front or of a burst of typically Dolby Digital for DVDs, and that gave you AV sync when you were creating that DVD in a kind of live scenario, you know, in real time. All those DVD encoders, they've been file-based for a long time, so I think that has that's gone by the wayside. Pause data, that's an interesting one. That came about, it was actually originated in the consumer side, because there's an equivalent standard to AS3, which you probably know as SPDIF or IEC 60958. Pause data was defined to be carried over that in 61937 standard. And people started using consumer devices in professional equipment, and the pause data bursts, which are transmitted classically when you press pause on a DVD player, they started appearing on AS3, and it was decided to legalize that instead of trying to ban it and trying to keep it off the transport. I'm not going to go into the MPEG stuff, mainly because I don't know too much about it. That's probably for another presentation. Dolby Digital Plus, this is interesting because it's different to Dolby Digital Plus as carried on the consumer transport. For one, on the consumer side, it's only carried over HDMI, and it's carried at 192 kilohertz, as opposed to on the professional side that we're talking about here, where it's carried at the native sample rate, audio sample rate 48 kilohertz. So they're fundamentally incompatible, in contrast to AC3, or where you can switch between the consumer side and the professional side relatively easily, just with physical connectors and impedance matching. Dolby AC4, that can be carried, that's Dolby's newest codec, which can carry channel-based audio as well as object audio. Because of the AC3 being legacy, at this point going forward, I'm not expecting to see that much, but it may appear in some applications. KLV, we'll talk about in the context of metadata. Now, they ran out of data types, so what they did is they reserved number 31 and created, made that in a signal for an extended data type, so there could be a lot more in the future. And serial ADM, which is one form of metadata, audio metadata, is signaled using one of those extended data types. Okay, so Andreas mentioned the channel status bits, and I want to highlight this because in the past it's got often badly implemented in equipment. We've had a lot of problems with equipment that doesn't implement it properly, and with -31 being implemented in equipment today, there's an opportunity to get this right, and I want to kind of highlight how useful it can be. Admitted, a lot of the fields are kind of like the pre-emphasis, you know, it could be considered legacy, but there's one feature that's actually quite useful and is worth retaining to get, and that's identification of linear PCM versus non-linear PCM, either data or encoded audio. I'm going to give an example to show where that comes into play. So let's say that you have a stereo pair, AS3 on SDI or whatever, that's switching between a codec, so in this case Dolby E, doesn't matter what it is, and PCM. So there's going to be periods where that PCM is going to be passed through a decoder, and portions where you're going to have the Dolby E is going to be decoded with 1 frame video latency. Now the danger is that when you switch back to encoded audio at the end on the right hand side here, that there's some kind of corruption and you miss the sync word, and there's a danger that the encoded data could be mistaken for audio and come straight through as a kind of full-scale blast, which obviously that'll keep any broadcast audio engineer up at night, that kind of scenario happening. So the channel status is a way to provide an extra level of protection for that and signal whether the content on that AS3 pair is either linear PCM or encoded audio or data. So that would be my one argument for trying to retain that and properly implementing channel status in products that implement 2110-31 or AM824. Okay, so I'm just going to highlight a couple of advanced, or I say rarely implemented 337 modes, because some of them are proving to be becoming useful again. And first one here is subframe mode, where normally frame mode, which is the common mode that's used for 337, you're putting the bursts of encoded audio across both the left and the right channels in alternately. So you go left, right for both the header and the burst. But in subframe mode, you can choose to either put everything on the left channel, so obviously the burst is twice as long, or the right channel. Not many equipment does this. There was some early Dolby equipment that did it, and I haven't really seen it that much since. But it is having added interest because there's real motivation to put metadata on a single mono channel to try and preserve other channels for audio use. So that is a reason to think about implementing this mode or supporting it. Another interesting mode, just quickly mention, is multiplexed mode, which 337 allows you to mark streams with an identifier, and then you can put multiple streams together in a kind of time division multiplex manner on AS3 pair. And not so interesting now, but back in the day it was useful for carrying lots of encoded audio streams on a single AS3 pair, reducing cabling and so on. Okay, so that's a quick review of 337. I'm going to dig into Dolby E now. So Dolby E, I think it's pretty unique as being in the professional only audio codec in the broadcast world. It never reaches the consumer, and it's used heavily in kind of contribution distribution applications. The classic use case, which I got up in the top right hand corner, is upstream of a Dolby Digital encoder, because it carries all the Dolby Digital encoder metadata, and the early products were designed to integrate tightly with Dolby Digital encoder. So we're bringing it up now because even though it's been around for a long time, it's proving to outlast the transition to IP, and we're getting people approach us to ask us, well, how do you do Dolby E over AM824 or 2110? And there's some characteristics of Dolby E, specifically the frame synchronization and the fact that the audio frames are phase locked to video. This is a very important characteristic of Dolby E, and one that needs to be understood if you're going to process it properly in an IP network. So by phase locked to video, I mean the bursts are aligned with video such that the blanking period that exists with SDI aligns with the blanking period or gap, the guard band that we call it, with Dolby E. And this provides an opportunity to do a switch both across video and audio at the same time without losing either an audio or a video frame. And that was inherent in the design to support that switching capability. Now, although Dolby E can do high frame rate, that was never widely implemented. And so the Dolby E you're going to see today is limited to low frame rate, so 25 frames per second, 29.97. So with progressive high frame rates in production, typically you've got this scenario shown on the right hand side where you've got 2 video frames for every audio frame, and that creates a complication because when you're switching, the switch has to be aware of the Dolby E frame structure to make sure you don't switch in the middle of a Dolby E frame. So for the specifications there, if you're implementing Dolby E, you've got to be careful of these kind of timing specifications. Make sure you get the timing right when Dolby E exits the product. And that's all specified in the documents put below. There's a general timing specification for both video and audio, and then also a specific one, RDD 33, that details Dolby E in specifically. Now we have got a lot of information about Dolby E on a developer website so if you want to know more about Dolby E, this is the place to go, and it covers the details of the timing. This is probably the most important thing that you need to know from a kind of systems perspective about Dolby E. And it includes this table, which is an important reference, which specifies the position of the Dolby E frame to ensure correct switching. So we're not expecting IP devices to necessarily generate or consume Dolby E, or at least that not being very common. But what we do expect, and we've heard from various broadcasters, is they retaining contribution links or links from other facilities, carrying Dolby E, coming into their facility and having to be transported across their IP infrastructure, and then maybe to some legacy equipment on the other side. So what's key here is when you think about that legacy equipment, that legacy equipment may be switching. And so the phase locked property of Dolby E has to be retained for that switching to occur without loss of audio. So that really affects the design of these gateways. And I think that's interesting for people who are looking at designing gateways and they want to make sure that they've got Dolby E support or support for encoded audio. And what we've got here is a quick overview of a design of a gateway going from SDI to IP to SMPTE 2110 or RAVENNA with AM824. Now, you've got your video, which typically with a kind of gateway, maybe you've got audio and video coming in from another facility and it's in another clock domain. So having to bridge the 2 clock domains is very common. So you have to deal in both on the video and the audio side with having to drop or insert frames of either audio or video. So depending on the audio that's carried in the various channels of SDI, you have to cope with these audio types in a different way. So for Dolby E and also AC4, because AC4 can be video frame aligned as well. But I think you're probably most likely to be thinking about Dolby E, at least in the short term. If you've got a stream coming in, maybe from another facility, you're probably going to want to make sure that any alignment problems that have happened upstream are corrected. And then in preparation then for being able to do the classic kind of frame sync, and you're frame syncing both on the video side and you can sync on the audio side at the same time. And you can do that because of the design of Dolby E, which is fundamental design of Dolby E. It was designed to enable this use case, and that maintains good AV sync. Now, if you're trying to do the same thing with other audio codecs like Dolby Digital or AAC or whatever that are not video frame aligned, then you're going to be forced to drop or insert frames at different times of the video because the audio frame sizes are different. And that is going to cause a slight variation in AV sync. It's inevitable. There's no way around it. But this is a good reason to use Dolby E for this application specifically. Now with PCM, which you wouldn't be going into a -31 stream, we can be going to a -30. You would typically cope with the clock domain with a sample rate converter. Now, this is a good reason why you should really carry all those encoded audio formats and go to -31, because some people, and I know products are out there that put encoded audio, specifically Dolby E, over -30. The problem with doing that across your infrastructure is you never know when one of these sample rate converters are going to come in to try and bridge a clock domain that you didn't expect. And that sample rate converter will obviously destroy any encoded audio frames. Okay, so in terms of alignment guidance, there is a piece of good news for trying to at least preserve alignment, is that if you have an audio video gateway that has ideal audio video sync characteristics, it will preserve Dolby E line position across that gateway. Obviously that doesn't help you if you're switching clock domains and you're doing frame syncs. Then you have to follow the design I mentioned previously. But if you're not, then you can take advantage of that property of an ideal audio video gateway. But you've got to be doing audio video at the same time to preserve that AV sync. If you break off the audio through a de-embedder or whatever, and then put it through an audio-only device or MADI converter that goes to SMPTE 2110-31, typically there'll be a buffer inside the audio receiver device to cope with packet jitter. That's not going to have knowledge of the video stream, and so it's going to appear as an offset on the audio, and that's going to affect your line position. So if there's a switch or whatever, you're going to be cutting in straight into the Dolby E frame. You can try and hack it by messing with the delay to get an end-to-end delay of an integer number of video frames and compensate on the video side, but that's not going to work for fractional rates. So really what you're looking at is using audio video gateways with Dolby E. Now, another thing, I don't know if anyone's doing this. I'm very interested to hear from anyone that is considering doing packet level switching of Dolby E. So that is maybe having 2 streams and switching between the streams at a packet level. So saying, okay, this next, I'm going to take a packet from this stream of Dolby E next. And one thing to be aware of if you are considering doing that, and if you are, please get in touch with me because I'd like to hear from you, is that the guard band in the worst case can be less than 1 millisecond. So using that 1 millisecond packet time, you could straddle the entire guard band and you'd be forced to split a packet. So really, if you want to do packet level switching, you're looking at 125 microsecond packet time. Okay, so broadcasters we've talked to, they're often interested in testing line position because they've dealt with it in the past with SDI and they know the importance of testing and making sure that it's correct throughout the network. And they want to test it in IP as well as in the legacy parts of their network. And so one way that you can do this is get your probably your SDI-based reference piece of test equipment that you've had for a long time that does Dolby E line position in SDI, and there's quite a few of them about. And then find a gateway that you know has good AV characteristics that does AV sync correctly, and use those two together to then test the IP stream directly, and that can get you through your testing in the short term. In the longer term, I do know of at least one manufacturer that's developing testing for Dolby E line position directly on the IP stream. If you're interested in that, please contact me, and I can talk to you about that. So, but in the meantime, you can kind of use the gateway and the SDI test equipment approach. Okay, so that's Dolby E. So we're going to talk a little bit about a newer application, which is professional audio metadata. Now, audio metadata for next generation audio, and by next generation audio, we're talking about beyond 5.1. So we're talking about immersive with height, accessible audio, so things like audio description or personalization, where you can change characteristics of your audio. So all these kind of advanced use cases. These require metadata in order to enable them, and I'll explain that in a minute. But it can exist in all kinds of kind of contexts in production. What we're going to focus on here is the kind of live broadcast case with streaming and so on. The file-based world is a lot more advanced. The ADM standard is pretty mature and is being widely implemented. Whereas in streaming, this is much more kind of nascent. So why do we need it? Well, if we think back to the classic kind of lineup case that you would have in your facility, where you'd have an SDI, maybe 8 channels of SDI embedded audio, and you statically allocate them to 5.1 plus stereo. That's a classic kind of combination, but it could be anything that's fixed. And that's what you have all over your facility, so you can do 5.1, you can do stereo, without any need for metadata. You have to nail down your dial norm, but you've probably nailed that down anyway because of -23, 24 through standardization. Okay, great. But in the future, you're looking at carrying lots of different types of audio. I mean, first of all, the immersive formats, which I've got over here, 512, 514, the .2, .4 refers to the number of overhead speakers that there are. These are immersive formats, and there may be, depending on the production, at least at this time, although 514 for production seems to be the winner, it's not absolutely settled. So there could be need for different formats to be carried. Certainly 512 is used in emission. Then also there's lots of different audio elements that you want to carry. And so when designing a lineup, to support these different use cases, you need a lineup that's flexible. Now, typically what you have is you'll retain your first 8 channels for kind of legacy and fallback, but you may have a number of channels, maybe another 8, 16 or 32 channels. So you're probably talking not about SDI at this point, you're probably talking about IP to carry that number of audio channels. And you want to pack in all the different elements that you need, but you need to describe what's there. So you need metadata to do that. And that gives you agility. It means as new cases come along, you can alter your metadata. You haven't got to throw away and start up with a new lineup, which is obviously going to be very disruptive. So the most common metadata format that I expect you may have heard of for next generation audio is serial ADM, and this borrows heavily from the ADM ITU BS2076, which has been around for a while and is used in file-based production. It's used for Dolby Atmos and so on. It's an XML based description. The serial ADM or streaming version of it takes a kind of brute force approach to this, of packing the entire XML structure and transmitting that once every frame. Now, if you're going to do that directly with just the XML, doing that once every video frame to enable on the video frame switching like you had with Dolby E, you're talking about a lot of data. You can get up for a complex use case into the quite a few megabits, and you're talking about many channels of PCM just for metadata. So the gzip compression, which we've measured about 12, 14 times compression, is really quite important, and this is an option in serial ADM. Otherwise, it looks quite a bit like those encoded formats over like Dolby Digital and Dolby E from a 337 perspective. It's another burst type, and it can be carried over AS3. It can be carried by extension over 2110-31, and so over an IP network. There is an alternative which is PMD or professional metadata, and this uses a binary payload as opposed to gzip to XML. So it's a lot more efficient. This was created by Dolby. It kind of predates serial ADM by a little bit. It's an open format. It's fully defined inside a SMPTE RDD, and you can get code to read and write it. It's on GitHub at the URL that's on that page. And there's also a reader authoring tool there. Because of the efficiency in using a binary payload, it's very fast, so low latency. So where you'd be looking at this would be very low latency applications where the limitations of serial ADM are becoming important. So lastly, for metadata, although at the moment, because legacy applications are important, so we're kind of expecting people as they embrace audio metadata to enable next generation audio, they're going to be interested in the -31 or AS3 SMPTE 337 base schemes for carrying audio metadata in the future. It makes sense to get rid of that legacy and not have the SMPTE 337 packing and all the baggage that comes along with that, having to do the bitstream detectors. It's much better to natively signal and carry audio metadata. And this can be done over a streaming method over RTP. And there was a project, AES-X242 within AES, to define a method for doing that. Then along came SMPTE 2110-41, the fast metadata project, headed up by Paul Briscoe, if you know him. And those were trying to solve very similar problems. The -41 had a much bigger scope beyond audio metadata, but could include audio metadata. So these projects have now aligned. The -41 is still in draft, as far as I know. But this is the method by which we expect audio metadata to be carried in the future. So then all that legacy of the 337 and so on will be dropped. And that method, the -41, will be able to carry any audio metadata payload, serial ADM or PMD, whatever you like, or something to be defined in the future. So time will tell us exactly which one of these schemes becomes industry standard, the industry embraces. We certainly hope audio metadata is successful because we want next generation audio to be successful and provide that kind of value to the consumer and help broadcasters realize that value. And we think audio metadata is an essential part of that inside professional audio production. So that's the last slide from me. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass back to Andreas.
Thank you, James. Very interesting look into the whole metadata technology and how it's going to be used. So you mentioned the RAVENNA website. That's always a good idea to turn to the resources section where you find quite a lot of information. Dolby has mentioned that they have information, particularly in Dolby E. The link is mentioned here as well. You can send in any question at ravenna@alcnetworks.de, of course, and I'm happy to forward anything to James which relates to Dolby E. Next webinar is next Tuesday. We will focus on PTP again. So I will have Daniel Boll from Meinberg with me. I will provide a quick update on the new PTP standard, the PTP 15, well, the PTP version 2.1, which is officially 1588-2019. And Daniel will dive into the topic of how PTP can be applied in wide area networking application, which brings us back to our remote session series, actually. So tune in next Tuesday if you're interested in anything which is going on with timing and synchronization in wide area networking scenarios. Again, thank you, James, for preparing today's presentation. That's it for today. Please allow us 1 or 2 days for preparing the recording and the slides, and you can download them from the Ravenna website. So thank you, everyone who stayed with us, and hope to see most of you, if not all, next Tuesday when the Ravenna webinar series continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Keep safe.
Bye.